And joining us now is indeed Antoni Cimolino, the General Director of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in, of course, where else? Stratford, Ontario. Well, it is Family Literacy Day.
Yes.
And to do our bit here at TVO, we thought we'd get a guy in here who knows a little something about a gentleman who was fairly literate in his day and still today, old William Shakespeare. Tell us about your first experience with Shakespeare.
Oh.
How far back are we going?
Well, a fair amount, 35 years, I guess. I was a student, and I visited the Stratford Festival with friends, and I came to see a play that I'd never seen before. It was my first time there, Love's Labour's Lost, and if you don't know the play, it's about a group of young men who decide that in order to improve the world, they are going to spend 3 years studying and renouncing women and not, just being good. And as a Catholic teenager, Steve, I knew this would not end well somehow. So my life changed that afternoon. I remember watching the play and laughing at these 400-year-old jokes and recognizing myself and my friends and the young people who were on that stage. And also, I found myself laughing with the other 2,000 people, almost all of them older than I was. And I felt in that moment this profound connection with humanity in a way that I'd never felt before. I realized that I was part of this great, noble family. And so I went home and I told my father that I wasn't going to go to law school, I was going to be an actor.
And he loved that answer.
Yes. Yeah.
You're from Sudbury.
I'm from Sudbury, and
and Dad was
an Italian immigrant, as was Mom, and they worked very hard. They worked hard to give my sister and I options, and I realized as the years went on, the options really came down to two. The first was I could go to university and become a professional and make something of myself, and the second option was death. And so
and you saw that edging closer after you gave that answer.
But I'll never forget my dad. He sat there and he looked at me and he said, "Vuoi diventare artista?" And the way he said artist, it was sort of a combination of pimp and car thief.
He'd like spit it out.
Yes. Well, now, years later, I think he probably knew more than he was letting on. But
well, you've done okay for yourself. Yeah, you sure have. But I guess one of the theories we hear about why Shakespeare continues to be performed at your place and, of course, around the world is because he has dealt with simple themes, simple characters, simple stories. Do you agree with that observation? Because many have put it out there.
No, I don't. I think that they are seemingly simple and they're profound in their complexity. I mean, I've spent 30-some years doing this work, and I've directed many of these plays more than once. I've been in them many times, and I keep discovering things, and I'm not alone in this.
Okay,
there's a great resonance in that.
If they spoke to you, though, as a 12-year-old, there would have to have been a simplicity. There'd have to be some kind of simplicity to them, right, in order to strike a balance with you as a teenager?
I remember bringing my son. My kids saw Shakespeare from the time they were 4 and 5. I remember my son in tears after watching Pericles. And Pericles, ends very well. The family's reunited. And I said, "Gabe, what's going on?" And he said, "Shakespeare, even when he's happy, he's so sad."
What an observation.
Yeah, because there is such a mixture. As Shakespeare says, our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together. And that's in each one of these plays. He doesn't take a simple view of life. He takes a quite profound view of life. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. I think his times, the times he lived in, were curiously like our own in many ways.
How old was your kid when he said that?
8, 10.
Really?
Yeah.
Chip off the old block, eh?
Well, I think he found the truth in the plays, because I think that's really Shakespeare's strength. He's written these brilliantly entertaining plays, but they contain this brutal honesty and a rugged kind of wisdom, and that's what makes them never go out of fashion.
I'm going to quote now from the New Republic magazine. This was in May of last year. One of your favorite people, American linguist, conservative political commentator John McWhorter.
Right.
Who says, "I submit, in full understanding of the actual fury I have evoked in some to whom I have ventured the suggestion, that Shakespeare be performed in translations into modern English. The irony is that people in foreign countries often possess Shakespeare to a greater extent than we do, since they get to enjoy Shakespeare in the language that they speak. Shakespeare is translated into rich, poetic varieties of these languages, to be sure, but since it is the rich, poetic, modern varieties of the languages, the typical spectator in Paris or Moscow can attend a production of Hamlet and enjoy a play rather than an exercise. A friend of mine has told me That first time he truly understood more than the gist of what was going on in a Shakespeare play was when he saw one in French. So the question is, should we maybe not should we, should you, when you do your thing, be translating Shakespeare into modern English?
Well, look, I think we've all had the experience of reading a piece of Shakespeare or language that's 400 years old and saying, I'm having a hard time here. That's why the festival does as much work as it does with teachers, helping them teach Shakespeare. And when you see these plays performed, they come immediately to life. There's no problem comprehending them. The issue here is the complexity of the language. And in the response I wrote to John's piece, I basically said, look, this stuff is rich. It operates on many different levels. He loves puns. So sometimes the words mean not only one thing, they mean three things in that given moment, and they're part of a greater web of words throughout the play that he keeps on playing off one on the other. To start changing that is to get in there and start dicing, cutting into that web and destroying it. It also flattens out the meanings. I mean, look, there are a lot of translations out there. We know how translations work. You take one word and you decide what it means and you put another word in its place. It's in that decision that you flatten out and reduce. So when you see one of these plays in another language, you're actually not seeing Shakespeare's play. You're seeing an adaptation. You're seeing a person's opinion, interpretation of that play. And that's great, but it's not the real McCoy.
But you make 1,000 decisions, you make 10,000 decisions when you mount one of his plays, and you have to make decisions that will bring your personality to bear on how you interpret the work, yes?
The only thing we get from Shakespeare, because he provided very few stage directions, the punctuation that we have in these books are not really his. They're done by, we hope some of it came from it, but basically they were all working from prompt scripts. What we have are the words. Those are the only things we have. You start changing that, then you're getting many steps away from the work. And there are a number of examples that John gave, and you know, they don't hold water. I mean, basically this work is immediately accessible once you see it performed, and you get all the various meanings of the words. Let me tell you for a moment how he goes about using those words, because it's important understanding his work. He will take a series of words that represent certain values. Let's say, in many of these plays, I'm giving examples he uses, legitimacy, that comes up in King John a lot, and in Lear. Honor, love. And what he tends to do is at the beginning of the play, he sets up these words who have these romantic values. It's almost like a currency that's pegged at an artificial value. And he starts to have people question, well, what is love? What is honor? And he has very smart people in the play making fun of it. And before you know it, you in the audience are laughing at, that's right, what does love really mean? What does honor really mean? What is legitimacy? And as those clever people, Steve, take over the world and things begin to go awry and the world gets very dark and black, someone comes out and shows a little bit of honor or just a bit of love or legitimacy. And we begin to discover what those words really mean, what they mean to us personally. So he is trying to establish real values behind these symbols. So to start changing those words, I think is really to not gain anything, but to lose a lot. You know, we have, as English speakers, we have this birthright. All the rest of the world has to put up with these translations, some better than others, but none of them the real McCoy.
So it would be a mistake to say, what's love got to do with it?
Yeah.
Leave it as is. I don't have to tell you, reading Shakespeare, and I know you've got education programs in place to make sure people do get it. But reading Shakespeare is considered a chore to many high school students, to be sure. So does he really contribute today to English literacy?
The one thing that I find the most inspiring thing is watching young people react to Shakespeare, watching them start to get the words in their mouths, the ideas, the back and forth. And that's inspirational. They latch onto it, they get it right away. So many of his plays, Stephen, are written from a young person's point of view. For instance, Romeo and Juliet, As You Like It, are plays where the young people look at the world that their parents have created and they say, how did you screw this up so badly? So that kind of questioning of all the things we take for granted as being right is something he was a champion of, and young people get that. So it's not just a question of reading it, it's a question of getting it on its feet. These are plays that were meant to be performed, and for in so many cases, these words that we see were first written by Shakespeare. He invented so many of them. They were first used in certain contexts by Shakespeare. If you look at the OED, you keep on finding the references go back to Shakespeare's work.
Want to give an example?
Oh, amazed. Amazed.
Amazed?
Amazed, which means being, maize being the word for corn, and being caught in the middle of a cornfield. I'm amazed and know not what to say. I'm confused. I'm lost.
I did not know that. Okay, for the next part of our discussion, you got to humor me a little bit, okay?
Okay.
As if you haven't so far, but you're really going to have to now. As talented as I know you are, I'm not sure that you can channel the bard in a seance here. Having said that, I want you to give me some sense, given your knowledge of the man, about what he might think of what's going on in our times today.
Right.
For example, the kind of political shenanigans that we're seeing on Parliament Hill these days. Can you imagine what kind of fun the bard would have with that?
Yes. His plays have many characters in them who are petty politicians, bureaucrats, and he took a very dim view of them. His view of politicians was quite interesting because he always seems to equate them with actors somehow. Like, you can either, if you're a good actor, you might just be a good politician, but if you're a bad actor, you're doomed. And I'm thinking of, you know, Henry VI or Richard II. Richard III was a very good actor, but a very bad guy, and bad things happen. Henry V was a brilliant actor, and he tells the audience, he says, you know, I'm hanging out with all these thugs and lowlifes, but really it's just to make me look better later on. And when he does become king, because he knows that he has a perhaps less than legitimate claim to the throne, he decides to unite his kingdom by instigating a war with France. And he gets the church involved. And because they want money out of the proceeds, they come up with some very dubious rationale as to why France should be invaded. So he invades France, and he does pretty well. Towards the end of the play, before a great battle, he goes out among his troops, and he dresses as a common soldier. And he talks to one of them, and he says, McMorris, and he talks to him about the cause, and he says, and the king's cause is just. And the soldier stops him, and the soldier says, you know, that's more than we know. I don't know if the king's cause is just, but I'm certain that tomorrow men will die. And if the king's cause is not just, then all those wives and the children of those men, and all, in fact, all those limbs that have been hacked apart will be there to greet him someplace else. So you go from wars for dubious reasons that have been caused, wars that are done for PR purposes, to a state where the king or the politician finds they have a lot of responsibility in their hands and people have died. Shakespeare could be describing the last decade.
That is totally relevant 400 years later,
Yes,
isn't it?
it is.
Do you know of any play Shakespeare wrote where he used the word prorogued?
He used rogues a lot.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
Prorogue, we're not sure.
Yeah.
How about, I mean, obviously he was the master of tragedy. What would he be doing with Haiti today?
You know, there are natural disasters in Shakespeare. Most of them tend, though, to be man-made disasters. I guess the one that comes to mind a little bit, and it's indirect here, would be King Lear. King Lear is a very arrogant man, a man who surrounds himself with flatterers. He makes a horrible mistake. He decides he's going to divide up the kingdom among 3 daughters, and he asks them which of them loves him the most. When the youngest one, who's as stubborn as he is, refuses to flatter him, he makes a mistake and he loses everything. He goes from being king to being a homeless person in a storm with no clothes on his back. And for the first time in his life, he begins to have some compassion and empathy with people who have nothing. He finds his daughter. He, for the first time, really connects with her. So the story is one of a man who had everything and in some ways had nothing. When he loses everything, he gains his soul. So I guess that this isn't really about the poor people in Haiti, but I guess for those of us who are in very wealthy countries, who think that we can gain happiness through more and more possessions, the answer is that actually it's in perhaps having less and feeling some compassion for others and acting on it that we find ourselves.
Well, that takes me nicely to the next one, which is, I presume he'd be having a field day with the arbitrageurs who on Wall Street got us into the financial pickle we're in right now.
Well, you know, he seemed to not pick especially on the financial community. You got the sense he was a pretty conservative guy. He didn't like speculation. Antonio in Merchant of Venice is ruined by the fact that he's extended himself too far. And so in some ways, and actually the little we know about Shakespeare's personal life, there were some corn purchases and the like at the time of famines, which has a lot of people questioning what he was doing. In Coriolanus, for instance, there are the poor who want free corn, and there are the rich who don't want to give them to them or feel they don't have a right to it. He seems to have not nice things to say about people all around in that situation. I think that his sense of this is that we should all be very careful and not overextend ourselves. He probably would have been buying T-bills.
But at the risk of oversimplifying this, Shylock is not necessarily, the greedy Shylock who wants his pound of flesh as well, is not portrayed in the most flattering of lights. I know there's some sympathy to him as well, but
yeah.
you know.
Well, Shakespeare does provide a defense as to why interest could be collected, should be collected. The fact is that people need Shylock. He's part of the community. Everybody knows that they need interest and money to be lent. So what's really interesting for me about Shylock is the fact that he has been punished for the very activity that they need. He's been ostracized, and he isn't really trying to get money. As a matter of fact, he refuses the money when it's offered to him. He wants justice.
Yesterday in the Toronto Star, there was a story about people in Nashville, Tennessee, protesting a production of Romeo and Juliet because it was apparently too sexual. And I wonder what you think the Bard would have to say about today's so-called family values as they are portrayed and enunciated, mostly in, I guess, evangelical communities in the United States.
Well, it's funny, the artistic director of that company called me yesterday and said, help, And I said to him, I phoned him back and I said, look, every time we do Romeo and Juliet, we have people up in arms. We have some teachers even who say, why did you put all that dirty stuff in there? And that's all in the text. So I'm wondering what they might be teaching, if they're not teaching that text. The fact is that he looks at sacred and profane love in that play. And you can't really understand Romeo and Juliet being truly in love until you see the imbecility and the silliness and the youthful carousing that happens before that with Mercutio and the rest of the boys as they're going on really about sex and making bad jokes and puns that are there throughout the piece. Later, though, when Romeo discovers Juliet and they're together, they become the most mature, the most
it's true love.
It's true love. They become connected, and they behave much better than all the adults in the play with all the conventional values.
And one last sort of comparison between his time and ours. Well, we live in a time today, the one thing you hear all the time, this is the title of Joe Martin's latest book, Relentless Change. We live in a time of relentless change. Was that the way in his day as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. You see, he was writing at the late 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, so he was writing after the feudal period. And during the feudal period, there was one God in everybody's view, and there was one church, and there was one way to speak to God. He lived in a period where people spoke to God in different ways. There was a schism, obviously, between the Catholics and the Protestants, and to get that wrong, to talk to God in the wrong way, could cost you your life. So there was a certain amount of disconnection, cynicism, questioning what is true. Years later, secular, rational, scientific thought would take the place of that. I mean, we began to think, well, we can build our house in industry and discovering new things. And Shakespeare, of course, predates all those discoveries in chemistry and biology and physics and that we take for granted. Now, let's move forward in time to 1910, where the man is at the height of that scientific progress and has great confidence in themselves, and they become highly civilized. And then in the 30-year period between 1914 and 1945, tens of millions of people are killed, not just in wars, but in the Gulag, at the Holocaust, from atomic bombs. The time we live in now, since that time, we question everything because we realize that we've lost a certain amount of faith in ideology, in organized religion. And this is not to say that we've lost faith in God or in simple humanity. But Shakespeare, when you said at the beginning of this interview, he was simple in his treatment, in that way, he is saying this really should just be about people and about our values and a little bit of honesty, a little bit of legitimacy, a little bit of love and integrity. And so he doesn't have a lot of faith in those other questionable enterprises, in his view, because of the times he lived in, and those times have a lot of relevance to the time we live in.
Yeah. I'm so glad you used the word enterprises there, because that's a great segue for where I want to go now.
Okay.
No discussion.
You're scaring me now.
Well, no,
okay.
no discussion of Shakespeare would be complete if we didn't talk about Star Trek. Now,
okay, I'm scared.
work with me here.
All right.
Work with me here. This is Kay Smith wrote this in college literature. The Shakespeare gimmick in Star Trek VI, the motion picture, is that the Klingons claim the Bard as their own cultural property and proceed to quote rings around the bemused officers of the Enterprise. Here, at the end of history, when the Klingons and the Federation are supposedly making peace, ideological opposition takes the form of cultural appropriation. General Chang has the presence and potential to be a true Shakespearean villain, like Richard III, magnetic and repulsive simultaneously. When he quotes the to be or not to be speech in Klingon and then says to the officers of the Enterprise, you should read Shakespeare in the original Klingon, he makes a cultural claim that causes us to smile, then to feel a bit uncomfortable as we realize how proprietary we in the English-speaking world are about the works of the Bard. I got to point this, you know who played General Chang in the movie, incidentally?
No.
Christopher Plummer.
Oh,
who's done the odd bit of work at Stratford,
I've
from what
heard
I
of him.
understand.
Yeah.
You've heard of him. Yeah. And he was magnificent in that, doing that whole to be or not to be. How do you think the Bard would have reacted to being quoted in Star Trek?
If he had an agent,
He'd want a piece of that action.
That's right. That's right. You know, he obviously everybody has a theory about who really wrote the Bard. O'Neill has this line about him being an Irish Catholic. The latest theory is that it was an Italian woman who lived at the time, and I kind of like that theory.
I bet you do, Senor Cimolino. I thought you might. Do you think, I mean, you referred to it earlier when we were talking about the fact that, you know, we've got this special relationship with it because we don't have to translate it to know what he exactly meant to say.
Right.
Does that mean we're a little too proprietary about his work, we in the English-speaking world?
I think we perhaps are more guilty of taking it for granted. I mean, the Germans love Shakespeare. Japan is in love with Shakespeare. He's performed all over the world. And I think they would give their eye teeth to be able to have it in the original language. For the investigation you can do, the close reading you can do, the enjoyment that comes from the... And of course, we understand Shakespeare better in some ways than we have any right to, because he helped shape our language. His language became our language because it was taught in school and other writers imitated it. So we actually, you know, we get a lot more than we may think, and we're lucky.
In our last couple of minutes here, I don't know if anybody knows this, but do you know whether Shakespeare had any idea whether he would be as big as he's turned out to be?
That's tough to say. There was, you know, he did well in his life. Out of all the playwrights that are there during this period, and there was a significant number, there's only he and Ben Jonson who did reasonably well in terms of making a living from it. So there was a measure of success there that he had financially, and his plays were performed. The eulogies he received afterwards, the fact that he actually had a folio done to his works, and the way that he is spoken of by the other actors and writers of the time tell you that this man knew that he was appreciated. But he wasn't performed all that much for a period of time after. He really was, became more performed after about 30 and 40 years after his death. So in a way, he would have known that he'd done well. He would have had a sense of appreciation, that he was appreciated, and he would have never known that he was the world's greatest rock star.
Well, that's it. Eh? He never knew that he'd be immortal.
And you know what? Given his writings, I think that's somehow right. We wouldn't want to think he ever got a fat head. And I don't think it would happen. He had his feet firmly on the ground.
It is so good of you to join us here at TVO on what is Family Literacy Day and help us understand who arguably is the greatest writer in the history of the English language. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And if you want to take advantage of Family Literacy Day, bring those kids to the Stratford Shakespeare Festival.
Absolutely. We don't mind plugging that at all.
All right.
Grazie, Signor Cimolino.
E anche a lei. Grazie.